So, Christopher Blunt, let me start with you. How would you categorise the current public mood, public attitude towards legalising or decriminalising cannabis?
I think the evidence lies in is it's about 50-50, which reflects many of the referendums that took place in American states, which were quite closely competed votes in order to impose a position on the state legislatures in the US. There's a very large majority for medicine from cannabis, and I think a majority of the public will be against legalisation of other drugs. I think that's where the public position is today.
Norman Lamb, do you agree?
Yeah, the latest polling I saw actually showed a majority for legalisation of cannabis. And I think the public is way ahead of the politicians actually on this. And I represent one of the oldest constituencies in the country, North Norfolk. And
well, you mean old by age?
By age.
So your constituents are bastard, basically.
They're certainly not. Many of them want to use cannabis for pain relief, incidentally, and find it impossible, even despite the government's reform, to get access to it through their GP. But, you know, I came out in favour of legalisation back in 2016. I faced a general election in 2017. I guess North Norfolk's probably quite socially conservative, but it did me no harm at all. And I just think that the politicians are still very, very cautious on this. And I did a 10-minute rule bill last autumn, making the case for legalisation. We got 52 votes in favour, including Crispin, which is the highest vote for reform yet, but that's 52 votes out of a House of 650. So we've got a way to go yet.
A long way to go.
A long way to go. But I think...
There weren't 600 voting against, though, to be fair.
It was, yes, the numbers voting, and Labour abstained, the numbers voting against were not that much higher. Lots of people abstained. But I think that it could happen actually very quickly. And we see what happened in Canada. The Liberal Party put it into their manifesto. They suddenly won an election rather unexpectedly, and then legislated. And I don't think it will take much for parties actually to shift position quite quickly as we start to see a sort of normalisation with the government's move on medicinal cannabis, even though it hasn't delivered access. It's, I think, quite a big moment that the government chose to announce a legalisation.
Which was done last autumn.
Yeah.
I'll come back to that, because it seemed quite limited at the time, and we'll
very
look at that.
I think 3 NHS prescriptions made so far.
So Mark Stevens, are these two are claiming that the public's ahead of the politicians on this, are they right?
I would urge a word of caution. I think although the public are very in favour of medicinal cannabis, I don't think you can make that same jump into recreational cannabis. I think that, you know, I have many members of the public who I speak to and see that there is a link between people who've got into cannabis, then moving on to much harder drugs. And to the point where I was only speaking to a victim last week who was telling me that her normal dealer, you know, couldn't provide her with cannabis, so offered her free heroin. I'm just saying, I don't think the public, I mean, that's why it's so important today. We need to have a debate that includes all members of the public, just not the ones who are very pro.
Norman Lamb, you were grimacing there.
Well, there's not that much evidence of it being a gateway to other drugs, actually. And if there is any evidence of that...
Sue's rolling her eyes at that.
Well, let me just finish the point. If there is any evidence of that, legalising cannabis so people can buy it through regulated outlets, as they've done in Canada, removes the link between the sale of cannabis and other drugs. And the key point here is that if people are buying their drugs on the criminal market, then people have no idea what they're buying. A criminal seller on the street has no particular interest in your welfare. It's not regulated in any way. There's no idea how potent it is. And so when I set up an expert panel to advise the Lib Dems on introducing a regulated market in this country, their conclusion, and this included a serving police chief constable bypassing from Durham and a retired chief constable, their conclusion was, on a public health basis, legalise so that young people can buy safely and you can get the criminals out of the market. The war on drugs has been a spectacular, monumental failure, and it's associated both with dangerous drug use but also with extreme violence. And the sooner we understand that we're doing nothing to protect young people from dangerous drug use by keeping it in the hands of criminals, the sooner we'll start to protect young people more effectively than we do now.
What's your reaction to that? What do you say to that, Sue Martins?
In Avon and Somerset, what we do is we offer people second chances. So the last thing we want to do is prosecute. We offer drugs awareness courses, the same as a speed awareness course, so that people are given those chances, particularly with young people. And we've put over 1,000 people through that over the last few years. So that's very successful. I think one of the things
But by what definition is it successful?
that they haven't reoffended since after that.
Oh, you haven't got them?
Oh, we haven't caught them. That's because we don't have enough police officers, of course.
They learned from the first time you got them.
No. It's a good point, Andrew. It's a good point. And one of the benefits of going on this drugs awareness course that we have found that we haven't considered before is the peer pressure within the group as well about taking drugs.
But if someone is found in possession in your area of Avon and Somerset, which includes Bristol, it's not that they're just told to move on. They are sent to kind of re-education camps, aren't they? So you're still implying that there's a sort of stigma to it. I mean, I'm not putting it on a par with what the Chinese are doing to the Muslims, which is a proper re-education camp, but you're still telling people not to do it.
They have the choice.
Well, they don't, otherwise they'll end up back in re-education camp.
They do, and the point is that we are trying to re-educate. It's hardly a boot camp. I think it's a couple of hours training.
I was only joking. You gave the analogy
of course,
that it was like speeding. It was like
also,
speeding.
and we will do everything that we can in Avon and Somerset not to criminalise. We absolutely we absolutely are convinced of that. And if you look at our figures, I think 0.3% of our crimes are to do with possession. But what we are not going to be considered is a soft touch. So we will go after the drug dealers. We will go after the county lines who are cuckooing vulnerable people. We will go after those organised crime groups. And that's one of the concerns I have, that if you change the way we deal with drugs in this country, and I'm very open for that debate, but don't ever believe that our organised crime groups will then stop. They will just move on to, if it may be drugs today, there'll be human trafficking tomorrow.
Well, that's not the evidence from the ending of prohibition of alcohol in the United States. The prohibition of alcohol in the United States generated enormous levels of criminality and of extreme violence. And the evidence shows that when that was thankfully brought to an end, levels of criminality did in time very significantly reduce. And
really? What figures are that?
I
Organised crime by 1950 in America was bigger than it ever was.
The levels of violence that were associated with the illegal market in alcohol were very high. And if you start to regulate a product, you take that criminality out of the market. And there is loads of evidence in this country of levels of violence that are associated with the criminal market in all drugs, in cannabis, but also in harder drugs. And there is an association between this and knife crime and in gun crime. And the awful thing we're now seeing is young people, young teenagers being used on these county lines, and they're the ones who get caught, not the criminals in charge. So the case for getting the organised crime out of this market is overwhelming.
Let me bring Crispin Blunt in here to try and place the British attitude and context. We've seen the legalization of cannabis at a state level in a number of states in America. We've seen it at a federal level in Canada. And these are all interesting examples for Britain to learn from. Where do we stand, though, in the European context? Where are we in attitudes towards cannabis compared to other countries in Western Europe?
I don't know the position of all of the other nations. I would have thought there is you would expect most people, given the proposition, if you can get medicine from the opium poppy, why can't you get it from the cannabis plant, to be strongly in favour of that, and that's our position. If our position in the UK on the data we've got is that it's roughly 50-50 around legalisation for recreational use, and probably people are fairly strongly against for other drugs, I don't see any reason why that wouldn't probably reflect the popular position across the liberal West, the West generally. However, it's what we need to do is follow the data here quite closely, and I know that the organisation I'm going to present, the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group, on Thursday. One of the pieces of work we're going to get into is this attitudinal survey to track what is happening with popular opinion. That's an important part of the background to the decision making on this, and giving politicians the confidence to get into the space to make decisions that are going to reduce what one is quite frankly the dreadful harm that is being done in the public realm by our drugs policies. And we've got to get people to understand the particular situation of the British position compared to others. And cannabis is actually quite a good example. If you go to the United States and you talk about psychosis in the young, they tend to look at you rather blankly, because it is not a problem on the scale that it is in the UK. And that's because in the UK, you don't normally have people buying their cannabis from someone who's grown it around the corner on a small scale, which lots of people consume in the United States. It's actually associated with a criminal supply chain that is also supplying hard drugs. And so that, actually, there is a transition in that sense. Oh, I'm afraid I haven't got any cannabis, but here, have some heroin, is not impossible, because it's that supply chain that is largely responsible for the supply. And that's why we have a significantly greater problem with psychosis in the young here, because it's very, very strong cannabis. It's being pushed on the streets by criminals. It's being sold to under 18s, let alone to people under the age of 24, all of whom appear to have a vulnerability of developing young mind if they are repeat users on an ongoing basis of very, very strong cannabis.
Young Americans are just on opioids instead.
Yes, which their prescription probably started in the doctor's surgery,
which is rather more serious problem.
Well, it's another sign.
Million people died. Don't think a million people in the past 6 years. Don't think a million people have died of cannabis.
No, and you're absolutely right. That's why it's obviously.
So let me ask you this.
But there is an issue here for an audience interested in cannabis. Is of course the potential substitutive effect of cannabis as a medicine for opiate-based medicines appears to be very substantial. Interesting, I'm told, now I don't know if there are many people in this audience who know the answer to this, I'm told there was the referendum in Arizona on the legalization of cannabis was very close. And at the last minute there was a substantial investment on the no side. And in Arizona they just said no. And that investment apparently came from someone who owned a chain of opiate rehabilitation clinics.
Okay, you can confirm that, yeah? Okay. It's probably just as well you didn't name him, mind you.
And of course,
since his lawyers may be watching us at the moment, but if he's in court for fraud, then maybe we're covered. Let me ask you this, though, crisp and blunt. See, I don't think opinion polls tell you anything unless there's been a national debate about the subject. And one of the difficulties that you have is I don't think you can have a national debate about the subject unless one of the major parties, one of the two major parties in England, is prepared to have one. Now, the Liberal Democrats every now and then would debate cannabis legalisation, which was a matter for much hilarity in the tabloids. The Labour Party abstained in your motion. Sajid Javid, when he loosened up the medicinal cannabis situation in this country, just by a bit, which we'll come on to, he made it clear. He said the government has no intention of legalizing cannabis for recreational use. So we won't get that national debate until one of the two parties, yours or Labour, are prepared to have that national debate.
And within both our parties now, there are drug policy reform movements, groups, and I'm...
Yeah, but you're a minority.
Well, this is where we then got to get a place where most politicians don't get beyond being in the place. Drugs are bad, they are banned. And actually, because I was a user sometime in the past, if I get involved in this area of policy, I'm going to get asked a rather difficult personal question. So I just don't, I'm going to touch this. I don't want to be in this space. And as we saw from the Conservative leadership election, where I think the majority of candidates then had to fess up that they were all criminals. But we knew that already. Describe as I'm apprehended felons. But there they are utterly representative of the public. I spoke with Mike Barton, the Chief Constable of Durham, at Freshers' debate at the University of Durham. There were 300 18, 19-year-old new students there, asked who had taken illegal drugs. 80% of that audience was 300 put their hands up, confessed to a crime in front of the Chief Constable. Well, why not? But that's because there is no respect for our drugs laws in practice. They're simply not working, which is why, and if that age group are in a place where they have already decided not to respect the laws of the land, I think we could begin to open up a space where we can have a conversation.
But Norman Lamb, a debate in front of 300 students at Durham University is not a national debate. How do you get a national debate going? Because although the medicinal cannabis, particularly with the Caldwell case and another case, brought it much more to the national attention on that particular area, there is very little debate about legalizing cannabis or decriminalizing. Am I right?
But I think the debate will come back. I mean, it exploded last summer, as you indicate, and the government, I think, felt obliged to move because there was the risk that they faced of little children suffering very serious harm or even worse because they were denied access to cannabis oil for epilepsy. But now what we've got is a reform that simply hasn't worked. I think there's been 3 prescriptions on the NHS. 4, sorry. 25% or 33% increase on what I thought. And so what you're getting around the country is people trying to access cannabis through the NHS and being rebuffed. I've got a range of middle-aged men who suffer in my constituency, who suffer conditions like fibromyalgia, arthritis, who are prescribed opiates on the NHS, and the levels of prescription of opiates in our country, let alone the United States, have rocketed in recent years, levelled off now. But then they go to their GP and they say, can we get access to cannabis? And they're told no. So you can get access to highly addictive opiates, but you can't get access to cannabis. So they just buy from the local cooperative, which grows illegally to supply people for their medical needs. But I think what will happen is that the government will be confronted by a growing sense of frustration. For example, I had a call from a parent from Norwich last week who was paid over £1,000 for a private prescription for their child to get cannabis oil for his epilepsy. Now, this family can't afford to continue to pay for those private prescriptions for more than a few weeks. This will last him 3 weeks. So at some point, you're going to get a group of families trying to bring in stuff through customs. There's going to be another explosion of press interest, and the government will be forced to move. And what we see in every jurisdiction that has gone down this route, cannabis gets normalised through the acceptance of its use for medicinal purposes, and then they take the next step of regulating recreational use as well.
Do you accept that, sir?
I understand what you're saying. I think you need to take the public with you. This is only going to be won by consensus. And I think that, if the public were as much in favour as you believe they are, more politicians would have supported you because politicians need votes. So, I think what we need to do, and I'm very keen to have this debate, and I think we have to look at the time lag. So I think we need to evaluate what happens in Canada. It's only just started, so I don't think we can't afford a mistake here. And in the same way with medicinal cannabis, you've already got the politicians to say, yes, we still haven't got it delivering on the ground with the NHS. So I think we have to go slowly, and I know that will drive a lot of people insane as far as their impatience. But we need to get this right, and I think watching what Canada does is the way for us to, whether we look at it 3-4 years time, about what's happened and see what we do here. But at the end of the day, as a police and crime commissioner, what I want to do is I want to reduce crime, and I want fewer people to be harmed by drugs. That's what I want, and that involvement with
is there not a difference? I'll come back to you in a minute. Is there not a difference, Sue Stevens, between going slowly or even going cautiously, monitoring what is happening elsewhere, and going with glacial speed to nowhere? I mean, at the moment, excuse me, I'm asking Sue. At the moment, we had this change in the law on medical cannabis, which was basically forced on the government because of particular cases to which it had no response. And a mother from Northern Ireland being prepared to be arrested at the border for a son who had been on medical cannabis and had improved in North America, and so on. But that change only involved prescriptions for severe epilepsy, related to multiple sclerosis was another one, and to combat nausea from chemo. That was it. It was the most. Let me put it this way: it was the smallest change the government thought it could get away with.
It has to be up to the politicians. The police. We don't live in a police state. And therefore it's the politicians who change the law and the police will work with them. What we are doing, because of the glacial speed that the politicians are taking this in, that's why we have got this postcode lottery, because in some places across the country, including in Avon and Somerset, we are working really hard not to criminalise our young people. But that is because our politicians have failed us.
I understand that you are working within the law. But it's a strange message that's sent out. So, for example, I look at the rule of the law as it stands at the moment. It is illegal to possess, give, or sell Category A and B drugs. Possession gets you up to 5 years and a fine. Supply can get you 14 years and a fine. But if your police stop somebody, they can also just go and get a little bit of re-education. I can't think of any other crime that would incur 14 years. But the alternative is to go to class for a couple of hours.
Well,
I mean, it's absurd.
Let me just mention one point. I'm an ex-magistrate, and when it ever came, and going back 8 years, when I was a magistrate, we would fine people on average £10 because we didn't want them in court. Court was the wrong place for them. So even that has meant that there is under the radar, there is this going on. But this is for politicians to change the law.
No, I understand that. So let's come to the politicians again. Crispin Blunt, using America as an example is quite difficult because it's been done at a state level. Yeah. And in terms of federal laws, cannabis is still legal, as I understand it.
Yes.
And it is difficult to cross state boundaries, you can't export it, whereas Canada can. Now, Canada has done it at a federal level, and although it has very powerful provincial governments, doing it at a federal level perhaps maybe a better example for a country like ours with a strong central government. So is that what we should be looking at? Is the Canadian experience crucial to us?
I agree with what is going to be the objective of the policy is to invite the government to give Canada 5 years to see how the Canadian experience goes. Roll the Uruguayan experience into that as well. No reason why we shouldn't be looking at the American states with all the provisos you put in the absence of banking facilities, etc. But the taxation regimes, the regulatory regimes, the licensing conditions in all these jurisdictions all have lessons to be learned for the United Kingdom if the United Kingdom is going to follow Canada in principle. And I think we should, after 5 years, the government should present that analysis of the Canadian scheme with all the other experiences rolled into it and a set of license conditions and regulation conditions applicable that will be applicable for the United Kingdom, and then ask Parliament to make a decision whether, on the balance of the evidence, it is the right thing then for the United Kingdom to follow.
Right, but let me just get this. Do we wait 5 years and then send a bunch of people to Canada to find out what's happening?
No, I think we should follow. We should follow it as it develops.
And then after 5 years, come forward.
And then my personal target would be then to, after 5 years, Parliament at that point is being made on the basis of the evidence accrued from Canada, Uruguay, the other jurisdictions who've gone the legalisation and regulated licence market route, and then ask the British Parliament whether it's then appropriate to follow for the United Kingdom, with regulations and licence conditions that would be appropriate for the United Kingdom.
So 5 years, Norman Lamb, it kind of gives new meaning to my word glacial.
Well, I absolutely...
That would be rocket speed in
Oh, maybe rocket speed by Westminster standards, but the rest of us it's snail speed.
I absolutely would not wait for 5 years, and there is a price to be paid for caution, in my view. The price is that we'll continue in a rather inconsistent way to criminalise people, and what's happening at the moment is that, as you rightly say, it should be the politicians, not the police, but what's happening is that you have reform-minded police officers choosing to, in effect, decriminalise in some parts of the country, whereas others continue to prosecute under caution. So it becomes a complete postcode lottery whether you end up with a criminal record. And that in itself is wholly unacceptable. And here's the other thing.
It goes against equality under the law, which is meant to be a basic precept of our society.
It completely does. And we maintain this awful hypocrisy that we have this embarrassment of one Tory cabinet minister after another admitting to being a criminal, as Crispin says. But meanwhile, poor black kids on estates in London continue to get criminal convictions, and their whole careers get blighted.
For cannabis?
There are still plenty of convictions for use of cannabis or cautions across the country. If you have a caution, that's on your record, and it can have a big impact on your career. And so this double standard that people who aspire to be our Prime Minister get away with it, whilst people from poorer communities continue to get the sharp end of our criminal market for drugs in general. And there is a issue of serious injustice here, that we criminalise poor kids, particularly from ethnic minority communities, whilst others in Westminster continue to drink their drug of choice, alcohol, or smoke, which kills 79,000 people in our country every year. How long do we persist with this outrageous hypocrisy? And why don't we move to an evidence-based approach? There's already lots of evidence from the markets in the United States for us to take a first step, and I think it makes absolute sense if we need to tread cautiously to move straight now to a properly legalised market for medicinal cannabis, not waiting years for clinical trials using the traditional route, but having a parallel process as in Canada. That would help to normalise it, and then within 2 years move towards legalising.
Are you saying on that, because the move towards medicinal cannabis is less controversial?
Yeah. There's overwhelming support.
And the more cases you see, the less controversial it becomes. But are you saying we should move towards medicinal cannabis on prescription without the same checks and research that is done for other medications?
It's much more difficult to get to clinical trial outcomes with a plant such as cannabis than it is with other medicines.
Yeah, but that could be a reason against it, not for it.
Well, but if you look at the harm that might be caused by going down this route, it's negligible. We already prescribe in vast quantities opiates, which we know are highly addictive and which on overdosing kills tens of thousands of people in the United States and now thousands in this country. So let's move to the availability of a product, just as they've done it in Canada, and actually for medicinal purposes they've had this in place in Canada for some years now following a court ruling, without devastating consequences, and giving people who are suffering acute pain and who need it for pain relief access to what they know and helps them massively, which at the moment they can only get on the criminal.
But that's always an argument for new drugs coming on the market, and if you're in particular suffering and you think this might help you. I mean, I remember in the early days of the AIDS drugs, when they come on the market, many AIDS sufferers were saying, look, I've got nothing to lose, just let me have it now. But for many people that will be a red light as well, that this should not go through the normal FDA approval or the equivalent in the United Kingdom or in other advanced markets, that it is properly tested and through the normal research procedures. Because, in a sense, the opioid is the example of which the things that could have done with a bit more testing because of their side effects.
Well,
I mean, you lose the argument if the FDA says, actually, we haven't approved this.
Well, cannabis is the oldest medicine of all and has been used throughout time. And the fact is...
That's not quite a serious argument, is it?
No, but the fact is that it's being used by adults using their own free will across our entire world, but they're having to buy on the criminal market. So does it not make more sense to stop someone who is using cannabis for the relief of pain, having to go to a dealer down the street and enable them to buy through a regulated...
I understand that, but and obviously that's not good. What I'm trying to get, though, is there are a number of... there's a lot of big business around that sees easy bucks to be made here and are producing all sorts of cannabis-based products or products with cannabis in them that could claim all wonderful, marvellous things if you take it. Shouldn't that be subject to proof and the normal regulation of medicine?
Well, this is where I think there is a case for a specialist cannabis authority of some kind, and a number of nations have gone down this route, which strikes me as being a better place to assess this than trying to drive cannabis through the traditional pharmaceutical system, because it doesn't really sit with, if you're assessing a molecule's effect on a particular disease with blind trials and all the rest of it, that's not quite where a plant-based medicine sits. There may be, at the very point of, I understand there is some experience now in Israel where the reduced down to 3-molecule effect on colon cancer, where it appears to be able to reverse colon cancer. In that space, you're beginning to get to a kind of pharmaceutical level of research and then assessment of that process. And there may be areas where you can then put cannabis-based medicines through the pharmaceutical system to pharmaceutical standards. But there is, I think, it is going to defeat our regulatory system here if we try and drive the system through the system as it exists now. My instinct is that we will need a specialist cannabis authority, as they've got, I think, in Germany and elsewhere.
But Norman Lamb, you still have a battle with, if not public opinion, with people in powerful positions. Simon Stevens, the chief executive of the NHS. The UK will be making a big mistake by legalising medicinal cannabis. It's normalising the use of drugs. There's a whole industry waiting to pounce. He says where cannabis is legalised for medicinal purposes, it has the effect of normalising it. It takes away the fear of using it. What do you say to that?
I've got a great respect for Simon Stevens, but I just fundamentally disagree with him on this.
But is he representative of opinion still in the NHS and the upper echelons of the medical profession?
There's extreme caution in the medical profession, and one of the consequences of having cannabis, the use of cannabis being a crime, is that we've lacked the research that can give us the information that we need to guide us. And by shifting it to a different categorisation, we can now undertake the research. And I'm totally in favour of doing the medicinal research to gain a greater understanding. And Crispin is right that in Israel they've done a lot of work in relation to a number of different conditions. So that work should be underway, but surely ultimately it should be up to free citizens to make a decision as to whether they use a product which has been used for thousands of years, not up to the government to criminalise you for it, for a product that is significantly less dangerous than alcohol, for goodness sake, which is drunk in vast quantities in the House of Commons.
Yeah, but if I was a pharmaceutical company and I said, I'm producing this product which will make people 6 inches taller. You just have to take it twice a day, and within 6 months you'll be 6 inches taller. You would say to me, where's the research? Where's the evidence? And have you got a license to sell it? There are going to be companies selling products, cannabis-based, offering all manner of things. Are you really saying, as a centre-left politician, that that shouldn't be regulated, controlled, subject to investigation?
Absolutely. I'm saying precisely what you're suggesting. It should be regulated and controlled. And, you know...
Just not to the same standards as other pharmaceutical products?
Absolutely. To expect to make cannabis available through the NHS only after the traditional route of clinical trials, we will be waiting years. And that means more people will take opiates, more people will get addicted to opiates, more people will die.
Okay.
And if we could get access now, then we will give an awful lot of relief to a lot of people.
Sue, you've been very patient in listening to this. Let me come to you. What do you make of it all?
I do think we are muddying the waters, and I think we're muddying the waters at our peril. I think there is one medicinal cannabis where I'm a very strong supporter of it. I think the general public are with you on this, and subject to evidence-based. You can't want evidence-based on one thing and not evidence-based on another. Subject to evidence-based, I think that it should be rolled out as on through the NHS. But it's very different to recreational. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't a natural link. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is there are companies here that are, you could either call them, bees around the honey pot, or you could call them piranhas, depending on which newspaper you read. But I think the real issue is, where do we go with medicinal cannabis? And we have to get it right. And we get it right by scrutiny, by governance, by transparency, and by ethical decisions being made that are open to the public. And I think that will lead the conversation on much easier to where we are going on recreational cannabis. I am not for recreational cannabis, but neither am I against. I'm saying let's go down the route of medicinal cannabis, which the politicians have already said yes to, and it's now...
But in a very limited way.
Okay, but it still isn't happening in a very limited way either. You've still only got 4 prescriptions for cases.
On the NHS.
So, that's still not acceptable, considering that you've already got the political will. So I think let's go down that route. Let's make sure that we have, though, with the companies that are involved, make sure that we have that governance absolutely right.
So, Crispin, where do we go from here? Because, like Brexit, liberalising cannabis isn't going to go through this Parliament, is it?
Well, this is where the option is...
Which the answer is yes, isn't it? Just saying, it won't hurt.
Yes, but
a straight answer from a politician. That applause is for me, I won't get any answer.
The point I was going to make underneath the yes is that in the United Kingdom, referendums are slightly fallen out of fashion. And
Sure.
and
We're not seriously talking about a referendum.
and of course, one of the options open in the states of the United States to impose a legal change. And I think in the first 11 or 12 states, to produce a legal adult use cannabis market, it was by referendum in the states, which then imposed a position on the legislature, and then the politicians and the regulators had to sit down and work out.
But in these states,
Yeah.
there was a tried and tested convention of having plebiscites.
Yes.
On a whole range of things. From
So that option
taxes.
is not open here.
In Britain, I would suggest, you know better since you're part of it, but I would suggest the political elite is not desperate for another referendum.
But that was the point I was making. No.
So you're not going down that road?
So that road is excluded in the UK, particularly on an issue like this. And
you're
so,
not
and so
slipping
therefore,
in a second people's vote.
and then
Do you want to leave or remain? And then would you like to liberalise cannabis?
Proposition 13 on the list.
How about that? All right, so I won't tease you.
No, I was just saying, I hadn't realised until you made a point earlier why the Dutch are now 6 inches taller than everybody else. Is obviously linked something to those coffee shops.
Sometimes you do take me a little too literally, President Black. Norman Lamb, how do you move this forward? I mean, I would suggest it's been particularly difficult because Brexit has sucked the life out of the whole political system. And politicians don't have the bandwidth to do anything but talk about Brexit. And that might not be about to change very quickly.
No, so I think the chances of us getting anything through in this Parliament are very slim. And what we don't know is what any new Conservative Prime Minister might decide to do on this. I don't have any great expectations of a shift of position there. So I think it will come down to manifestos at the next election. But as we witness what goes on in Canada and increasing numbers of states across the US, I just think that it will become increasingly accepted here that we have to change. And the dreadful thing that we've got at the moment is that people who have money can get their private prescriptions for cannabis in this country. They're imported from Canada, from the Netherlands and other places. But people who rely on the NHS cannot get it, even if their children are in acute need because of epilepsy. And that's a wholly unacceptable situation. And I think
But if they can I just to clarify, if they've got the money, they can get a private prescription?
Absolutely, and there are lots of...
So there's an inequity involved.
There is a total inequity. One of the problems we've got with the system that we have following the reforms last year is that for a doctor to prescribe cannabis, a cannabis product, because it's not licensed, they take personal legal liability for anything that goes wrong. And so most doctors are cautious and won't therefore prescribe. But some doctors are choosing to set up private clinics, and I had an email the other day from a company just about to set up a private clinic. They want to be on their advisory board. There's a lot of money in this, so people with money will get access and are getting access now, but people who don't have the money are left waiting.
I've got a couple of questions from the audience. They've all been suitably vetted and gone through the biasometer to make sure they've got the right kind of bias, which are all in favour of. Would the panelists support conviction expungement? Sounds quite painful. For cannabis offenders, should the UK legalise? Sue?
No.
Norman?
Yes, very definitely. I was in Canada recently. I heard from a black professor who was making a very powerful case for expungement. Most convictions are in poor communities, and they blight those communities, and they blight the individuals who have those convictions. And they are convictions for using a product that is less dangerous than alcohol and smoking. So it should be expunged.
I just want to come back to Sue because I saw some eye rolling there. It wasn't quite to an Emily Maitler standard, but I did see the eye rolling. What would you like to say, Sue?
I think you can't. I mean, as far as alcohol, it's very different, and I think in as much as and there is always the argument of that, but you know, you can't get hooked on the first sip of alcohol as you can get hooked on
families across the country are blighted by alcohol.
Of course they are, and I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that you don't get hooked quickly. So what I am saying, as far as
don't with cannabis either.
well, I'm not talking about cannabis. I'm talking about cannabis being the gateway, in which we are going to disagree. But what I am trying to say is that we already look at the law. That's what happened. You cannot retrospectively go back and expunge convictions. But I think that we are already seeing, when we look at disclosure of previous records, that as far as possession, it is already being downgraded, and to the point where employers and the police will not take it into consideration.
Okay, but perhaps not the American Border Force.
My answer is yes, by the way.
That's why I wanted to come to you. Well,
and we do have to address this link, this gateway issue.
Well,
it is a gateway,
I'm going to come back to,
but it's a gateway issue because the supply chain is the same.
Hold on.
And if the supply chain is
right,
different,
no,
then there's very much, there will be much less of a gateway.
What bit don't you understand about the word chairman? Because, and I will let you come back to it, because we've got another question from the audience, a second one, and it's for Sue, but I'll then get the two of you to respond. If cannabis was legalized as a recreational substance, how would it continue to be a gateway drug? Sue.
First question.
Oh, you didn't hear the cover. I'll do it again. If cannabis was legalized as a recreational substance, how would it continue to be a gateway drug?
Well, I think there are two issues. Obviously, it's going to be to do with price, and even if we look at the cannabis in Canada, that 74% of cannabis consumption is still through illicit markets. So although it is coming down, it is 74% still through illicit markets. And I would also say, as far as Canada, and I know that we've disputed the figures, but in the first year, the number of cannabis users have doubled. So from 327 to over nearly 700,000 of individuals. So that's the figure. As far as, and I am playing to a certain point devil's advocate, because I'm not necessarily, it's a very bland panel, if we would agree. But
a very what panel?
Bland.
Bland.
But what I am trying to say is,
right.
Politicians, unless it becomes part of our manifesto, and apart from the Lib Dems, it is very rarely ever mentioned within part of anyone's manifesto. Unless that debate is going to be had, and I would say that we can't afford to wait for manifestos. While Canada is ongoing, we can evaluate what is going on in Canada. There's no need for us to wait for the whole of the 5 years to start. We can evaluate it there.
But I think that's what Chris Blunt was saying. And after 5 years, you think we'd be in a position to say something with authority. But I interrupted you. You were addressing the issue of recreational gateway.
Yes. So I think the point is, the reason, if there's any gateway effect in the UK, it's because the supply chain is the same for the illegal substances. And therefore, someone who then, I think as Sue said, the dealer had run out of cannabis, so he then gave a free sample of heroin. Well, if your cannabis is coming out of a very regulated retail market, which is stopping kids going into it and the rest, and you've managed to put the criminal supply chain of cannabis out of business, then you're not going to get that gateway effect of transition from one drug to another. And indeed, you will get much more respect for your drug laws as to why there was a difference between the handling of drugs that are self-evidently very addictive and dangerous, and those like cannabis, where frankly out there on the street, they know that it's not as dangerous as alcohol, and that's why they were failing to deliver the message on psychosis, because we're not getting that message across that there is a real danger from heavy-use cannabis, heavy-duty cannabis in the young, and we have to get that, and that message has got to be across as well, and you can protect children if it was legal.
Okay, we're coming to the end of this panel, but not quite. Let me cut to the chase, as they say on American television. Let's assume that the use of medicinal cannabis continues to spread, that it breaks out of the rather tight regulation at the moment, and we see more use of it. When will we see a substantial liberalisation of recreational cannabis? Soon.
And the politicians get their act together.
So not for a long time.
Well, you can't do this piecemeal. You can't do it just by police forces across the country.
No, I understand.
It has to be, and if you think about it, if it was, with all the evidence that our two learned colleagues here are talking about, if you can't persuade more than 50-odd politicians to go along with it, how are you going to take it out of the political realm and make it legal? How are you going to do that?
Norman Lamb.
Well, I think it could actually happen within 5 years, because I think things are changing now so rapidly globally. There's an explosion in the market for medicinal cannabis. I was hearing that many European countries are now moving quite rapidly towards establishing some sort of medicinal market for cannabis. The European market is where most of the interest is internationally, but I think that as each year goes by, we just normalise our attitudes towards this drug, and we get away from the wholly outdated attitude that this should be something that is anything to do with the criminal justice system. The idea of giving someone a criminal conviction for taking a natural substance, which we know is less dangerous than smoking or alcohol, is utterly ludicrous in this day and age. And I think public opinion is changing rapidly, and that will force the politicians to change as well.
All right. Congressman Blunt, any advance on 5 years?
No, because 5 years is the time which I'm going to aim for. It is the reason I'm on this panel. I'm the first Conservative to be a co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Drug Policy Reform, and it reflects the fact that this conversation is now coming into the mainstream of politics. So my fellow co-chair Jeff Smith from the Labour Party, we replaced Paul Flynn and Caroline Lucas. Well, with the greatest of respect to both of them, and the late lamented Paul Flynn, who was a terrific campaigner for cannabis reform, they were right on the extremity of the political debate. And this conversation is now coming into the mainstream, to the extent that in 2 days' time, we will launch the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group, and I'm finding a very sympathetic response from colleagues. I have not wasted my time in the conversations I've had with the potential leaders of my party to alert them to the arrival of this group and this issue, and we have one huge advantage. The evidence is on our side. So what we've actually got to do is create the space for that evidence to be assessed, and God bless Canada for giving us a nation-state case study to follow. And if we can say, give the Canadians exactly 5 years of operation, and then have the government assess it during that period, and then after 5 years present the question to Parliament, I think there is a decent chance that we can get this hopefully over the line in 5 years' time in a way appropriate for the United Kingdom.
Thank you for that. I think